I want to start asking audience questions, but I just want to note something about the narratives and how we need to move past certain areas. I was here at a Hawkins event just a couple nights ago where a filmmaker I knew from who had been based in Beijing and another filmmaker were presenting a film called Made in Ethiopia about China. And it was about looking at a factory similar to the one in the Midwest that you just mentioned about the Chinese factory in Ethiopia. And one of the people on the panel after the film was saying that in Washington, we always talk about U.S.-China competition in Africa, as we mentioned earlier in the conversation with Margaret on Latin America. But he was noting, this is a former U.S. diplomat, he was noting that America just isn't present economically in Ethiopia. It's really dumb that we talk about this competition in Africa when the U.S. isn't even there competing on a commercial level in Ethiopia. So it's like a fabricated conversation that we're having here in America. And I think a lot of the issues you talked about, Shawn, about China putting investment in other countries with BYD and other vehicles is the same thing.
Yeah, and I think it's absolutely vital. I think we've gone from a world in which, and this is, taking the longer arc of history, post-World War II world, in which the US was the power that was going out there and creating jobs and opportunity in a lot of other parts of the world, whether it's in the Marshall Plan or moving to Latin America. I think of something like Citibank, right? There were city bankers all over the world of different nationalities. They had subsidiaries all over. I think of GE. I think of all these big American companies that were going out into the world and setting up operations and so on. And that just doesn't happen very much anymore. The U.S., and this started in the first Trump administration, the second Biden administration, we saw it also with IRA, where it was sucking in investment. Right? And it's still, I think, a net exporter of FDI, but it's not the same presence that it once was. And in the last 5 years, in the last 10 years, China has all of a sudden become this big source of outbound investment into places like Ethiopia, and so on. And a lot of it was through Belt and Road, right? And there was huge suspicion here in Washington about that. There were lots of questions about how it was done and who actually got the jobs and the exporting of Chinese labor into a lot of these places. But for a lot of other countries in the world, China has been a job creator. And the U.S. has kind of been this lecturer for a while, and now is kind of pulling back and saying, actually, we want you to invest in us instead.
I think some of the conversation around Belt and Road in the first Trump administration shows how some journalists and others, including at my paper, got the narrative wrong because they focused a lot on what Washington was emphasizing, which is this debt trap diplomacy. And it turns out a lot of the projects aren't actually a form of debt trap diplomacy. I think that was a big, misfire on the way that both U.S. policymakers and journalists and maybe some scholars are interpreting the outcome of Belt and Road projects. So I think we've seen the discourse on that. Because the reality is not what people were saying the first time.
Yeah, although to be clear, a lot of the structure of a lot of the financing that China put out as part of the Belt and Road was pretty tough. I mean, using accounts that kind of capture export revenues in order to pay to pay off loans. I mean, aid data has just done some fantastic work detailing just the structure of the financing. And so on, but you can't, and you can look at countries like Zambia and Ghana and so on, and there clearly is a debt issue there, and China plays a big part of that. But yeah, it's not as simple as purely about that.
Yeah, I think the thing I'm thinking of is that a lot of the framework, especially it was being pushed by some officials in the first Trump administration, was that this was a centralized effort to get countries into debt so that then they would be able to turn commercial ports into military ports of the PLA, things like that. So anyways, let's go to questions now in the audience. The woman in the green there.
My name is Tara McKelvey. I used to be with BBC and with Radio Free Asia. And I'm wondering if you can tell me about how you see the Ministry of State Security or the Chinese intelligence services. Obviously, they can't be here, but they have assets, sort of. And I'm wondering what your impressions are both of the services themselves and how it affects your life, if it does.
Internal security is Jim.
I mean, this is a really rich source of stories in the United States. I mean, it's something that I've spent a lot of time on. I was just talking with somebody last night, and we were talking about United Front. If you start to think about how United Front operations work around the world, it can very quickly sound like you're talking like conspiracy theory. You know, that they're everywhere, but they're nowhere. You know, do they exist? Do they not exist? And I think that it is a dimension of China that really just demands a lot of coverage. And we look at that of being transnational repression. I was just walking around in New York City the other day, and there was a giant piece of art, not exactly my taste, but it was quite interesting, which was the subject of a major operation by United Front people in China to go after this China-born artist. I think he was based in California. He made this giant head of Xi Jinping with all of these corona spikes in it. And these people who were affiliated with Beijing went and destroyed it in the California desert. And I think that people went to prison over it because they were unregistered agents of the Chinese government. So it's a real thing, and we cover it quite a bit.
In the front here with the glasses.
Hi, this is Wendy, a postdoc from University of Virginia. So I have two questions. One for the journalists here, like Jeremy and Shawn. So do you see your role as a journalist from a professional outlet shifting over the years? I'm asking because, as you know, a lot of audiences, they consume China stories from ordinary social media users. There were a lot of like TikTok explainers out there explaining what's going on about Chinese internet culture, what's the daily life here in China, and something like that. Do you sense a bit of like competition, or how do you see your advantage still as a professional outlets like journalists? And then second question, I will be quick. For Margaret and Jeremy, at the same time, because I teach Chinese media class at the institution, so I know like teaching China class is quite challenging these days because the causes a lot of tension and also disputes. There's one group of students probably have strong opinion about China, and there's another group of students not knowing China much yet. So I don't know, like probably a lot of us can relate to my situation here. So how do you see the do's and don'ts when you teach Chinese classes in the classrooms? What's your advice and best practices?
You want to start with the journalism?
Yeah, I have a 20-year-old son and a 17-year-old daughter, and if I was to pop on TikTok, I would probably get excoriated at home. And so I think there's and you know, and there is some there's always, I think, some pressure in the newsroom to do social media stuff in videos and so on. I consume less social media than I did a few years ago. It's healthy. I also really appreciate sometimes the surprising depth of the conversation on social media about stuff. I know I was kind of tossing away TikTok videos and so on, but there's a level of communication that's happening there that isn't just cute cats. And so I think my job is to kind of start a conversation and to kind of introduce new facts. I mean, my kind of AI strategy is, and the way to kind of keep my job and in an AI world is to do things that AI can't. And so AI is very good at aggregating existing information. But if I can throw new information into the mix, at least for a few seconds of the day, I'm gonna have relevance to the conversation, right? And then the conversation kind of goes from there. So but I really admire colleagues who are very good at tapping into the memes and doing social media. I've got a great face for radio and probably a constitution for print.
You see something about those videos. I think that it's partly just the way social media is developing, but another part of it is I think the Chinese government runs a very, very sophisticated media program. And it is tapping into influencers who basically just say positive things about China. And some of the things that they point out are really, really fascinating. The subway that goes through the buildings in Chongqing and things like that. And I think it is with fewer Western reporters in China, they're getting fewer of those kind of stories because we are just focused too much on, we're not focused too much, we're focused a lot on the great power relationship. When if we had more people, if we had back to the whatever 15 or so people that we had Westerners in Beijing and Shanghai, we would be doing these kind of stories, but I think we'd be doing it in a more balanced way than this is just rah about China and asking questions about that. I think it's a new dimension, but I think we really have to see the hand of the Chinese government, the Chinese state in the media there.
On the education question of teaching, I'm teaching a class this semester, Chinese politics and climate change. And that class is great because it has students that really care and are very knowledgeable about climate change and know nothing about China. And there are students that know a lot about China and don't know a lot about climate change. And so it's tough in the sense that I have to try to bring up to speed the class in different ways and then kind of like integrate these discussions. So it's not just about climate change broadly, but about Chinese kind of decarbonization and the politics and political economy there. So my advice, such as it is to try to think about, right, China classes, if it's just China, that's hard. If you have like a set of students who are Chinese and a set of students who are not, or who have a deep background and those who don't. On the other hand, I will say that when I have taught these kind of big intro to China classes, I've had Chinese students come up to me and say things that they are learning about China that they didn't know themselves. And I guess I can thank the propaganda apparatus for allowing my work and my kind of lectures to have some utility even for those who grew up in the country.
I won't add too much more to that. I have, similar challenges. And then also, of course, teaching about China, Latin America, you have those that are Latin Americanists, right? You have those that come with a China background, some that have a little bit of both, right? And then some that are more focused on different functional domains, right? And are interested in understanding how those apply in this particular relationship. So it's really a mixed group, which is it's a blessing in many ways, right? You have all of these strengths, and so it really contributes to the discussion. Everyone can bring something to bear, and so the idea is to get, at least at the beginning of every semester, I try to do a little bit of a who's who mapping, right? Just to get a sense of who are we talking about on all of these sides, and what is it really? Who are the institutions? It's a little bit 101 for some folks, right? But all tolerate it because they get a little bit out of that exercise. And then inevitably over the course of the semester, there are conversations about Chinese statistics, the reliability of the statistics, what it means to, do real data work, what you have to do, getting into the trenches on that, right? And we even do some exploration of some of the work that I've done in other institutions, trying to pull together this data and have it for the first time. And then also, how do you read? This comes up every semester too. How do you read? How should I interpret these policy documents? What is the terminology that's being used? Is there value in looking at these things over time? What different methods can be used to really glean as much, right, from all of these different documents as possible, and incorporating those in the syllabus, as well as other, foreign language materials that can be utilized by the different students in the class with different strengths.
And the second relative? Right behind you, yeah. Right third row.
Thank you for this. My name is Nayan. I'm a journalist as well as a policy research analyst. So I'm a contractor at the Rhodium Group right now. I have a couple of questions. One about, I think, Edward, you mentioned about, the narrative piece of it. I'm just thinking in terms of the coverage that comes out of the West these days, or even the last few years, maybe a decade, from China, is more about, even you look at clean energy sector, where China has clear leadership, but the coverage is sometimes focused more on the problems with that, the problems of overcapacity, or the problems of China choking other countries of those technologies. So my question is, how much influence, of course there is an influence of national security concerns of the US on Chinese policies, how much of that is reflected in the reporting right now, and what can be done to make it more objective in our writings? Second question, just about, very quick question about the popular myths about China. You already mentioned about the debt trap diplomacy. I just maybe want to know from the speaker about more, like, do you have a list? I do have my list, but I don't want to share, so I don't want to follow your opinion. But do you have a list of popular myths that have currency even now when we talk about China? Thank you.
I have my own thoughts on this, your question on national security concerns, but I want to hear from Shawn and Jim about, since they obviously grapple with this question coverage.
I was gonna let you go first, but
I was thinking about what I was gonna tell my editors about your story.
I'll tell my editors that you said that. Look, I think popular myths, whether we're too negative, are just a professional issue across journalism, whether it's dealing with China or not. I think of the American Rust Belt, right? I also have another story up today about which is a kind of weekend essay that we do on thinking about Pittsburgh, right? And thinking about the kind of eds and meds model there. And this weird clash that we have, or that the Trump administration is framing between universities and kind of industrial America. And actually they're much closer related, and the future of industry is being born in universities and so on. So I think that's one example here in the, it drives me nuts whenever someone says the economy is great or the economy stinks, because it all depends on where you're sitting, right? And the US economy is yes, there's this, the macro economy, but it's many different economies. I think the economist Margaret pointed out recently that probably a dozen US states are in a technical recession right now. And so you need to think about that. Depends where you are on the income ladder, right? The top 10% of consumers in the United States are now responsible for 50% of the consumption. It might even be 90% of consumption. I might have that number wrong. But the point is that the bottom 10% of by income aren't doing so great. And so it's this applies to China, it applies to the United States, it applies to Europe. I think the cartoon version of the French probably isn't very close to reality, et cetera, and so on. And I just think you have to constantly, as journalists, kind of just push like, do I really know this? Is this really what I see? Am I being objective here, and so on? And I don't think that's saying, on the one hand, here are the negatives, and on the other hand, here are the positives. I don't think that's always being negative, being objective. I think there's a kind of a balancing that you have to do, and so on. So that's a really long way of me avoiding your question.
Do we frame China stories too much in terms of national security, US national security concerns?
Well, I think that the, when it comes to a lot of, so-called myths about the way China is operating, let's just say technology, I think two things can be true. I think that there can be a state-directed effort to try to control a particular technology, but I think there's also a pure profit, huge, profit motive based on, deep competition in China between companies trying to build the best possible product. I mean, I think it's as simple and complex as that both can be true.
If I can jump on that
Yeah.
point, I do think the idea that there are narratives that is an important idea, but it's also important to remember that there are facts that are separate from those narratives or that exist outside of them, and that narratives can shift. And so I think that Shawn's story is something that I've been trying to convince people in DC that need to be prepared. If you're interested in kind of developing EVs in the United States, what happens if there is a deal with Trump and China about kind of encouraging China's investment in the United States? Is there going to be local resistance to that? Is there going to be congressional resistance to that? Is there going to be labor resistance to I think thinking through these beyond the narratives that exist today or are dominant today, to think through the possibilities and get outside of those narratives. I think it can be very hard, especially in this town, to get beyond anything narratives that dominate the day, to think about scenarios and possible realities. And I think that one thing about this administration and this president is that uncertainty is real and present always. And so having to think, I think it encourages and rewards those who are willing to think about what if, because there's a lot of what you never know what is going to happen.
And then on his second question, and let me ask Margaret and Jeremy about this, like what are, he wants concrete examples of like a type of framework for China or narrative that has now, as dominant, still dominant now, but that we think that you might think is a myth. And so is there, what are some examples of that?
I guess here I would say something like the idea of China Inc., the idea that China works as a kind of like universal actor that is kind of going about the world acting on its own interests, when in fact, as was just hinted at, right, Chinese firms are in cutthroat competition, like destroying each other on a day-to-day basis, and BYD investing in Brazil is very different than the various other like kind of like EV, like neo investors. Like they're trying to kill each other, these firms, and they're fighting. And so the idea that this is all in China's interest as opposed to interesting actors inside of a country of 1.4 billion people kind of pursuing their own self-interest inside of a political system that has particular rewards and constraints. It's a much more complicated story than China Inc. And we need to worry about what China is doing. I think breaking that kind of singular piece is for me the biggest myth and dominant frame.
Yeah, I mean, and then I would add, that's a terrific one. It's one that I've thought about a lot too. Just, I mean, China Inc. also kind of grand strategy, the idea that Xi Jinping is sitting there making every single decision about every, about every investment that's being made across the Latin American region or wherever, right? Which one is it's one that's pervasive and it's certainly here, reference to in the Latin American context as well. Debt trap, I mean, as we've already talked about, right? That's one, and especially in Latin America, since we haven't really seen finance there. And large scale loans, right? Sovereign lending there since around 2015, 2016 in any real way. Certainly not the 40 billion that we saw in 2010, for instance. The other one, this is not about China necessarily, but it's one that you hear in Latin America, which I think is, or the US perpetuates, right, about its relationship with Latin America vis-a-vis China. And it's that the US, and I don't know how often I hear this, probably on a monthly basis, that, if only we were there and only we were doing things, that we would be the preferred partner. And that may be very well be true, right? I mean, if there's a US offer, if there's an infusion of capital, if there's something of a coordinated strategy, right, that could be proposed, whether at the bilateral level or hemispherically, that would be preferred to anything China has to offer. But I think we need to think a little bit more in depth about that, and especially because there are different things that China offers, right? And a lot of this that the US is not capable at this particular juncture of providing, whether it develops a strategy or not. And so really thinking through that particular assumption would be really, I think, quite valuable.
So I have good news and bad news. The good news is that lunch is here. I see in the back. The bad news is we're out of time for further insights from our panelists. One thing that Margaret's last comment on grand strategy brought to mind is I can't count the number of times I've been at parties or discussions in Washington where someone will come up to me and they'll say, and we'll be talking about US-China policy usually, And usually it's someone who is somewhat critical of the US approach to China, whether it's in a Democratic administration or Republican administration. He'll say, well, the Chinese always think of things in terms of decades or centuries, and we're very short-sighted. And it's like one of the biggest myths, I think, about policymaking in China. There are many myths out there. And that's like it's generally people use that in a positive manner about China. But anyways, thank you to everyone on this panel for your insights. And thank you to Shawn for giving us previews of your stories. And thanks for the great questions. And we can have more discussion of all this over lunch. Thank you.